In the town of historic Stony Brook lies a hidden gem. The Stony Brook Community Church is a Methodist church that stands tall on Christian Avenue, a short drive from the historic Village Green. Rightfully so, the church is a part of a list of historic buildings in Stony Brook, as it possesses a long, rich history. However, the church is more than just the building, as the congregation has existed longer than the church building itself. So let's journey back to where it all began, the humble home of resident Deborah Davis.
The church had its foundations in the home of a local woman by the name of Deborah Davis in 1809, who was converted to Methodism and began holding classes and worship services.
Preachers, known as circuit riders, were invited to her home, in which her home became their home, and ultimately a house of worship.
3 different pastors who were part of a circuit locally on Long Island, and so there were 3 of them, and they came to Stony Brook after being asked by Deborah Davis, who had recently converted to Methodism, and so they were the ones that basically were doing the original preaching in our community.
As Deborah Davis continued growing and building the church, she realized that the congregation was getting too big for her small home.
They continued in that fashion for about 9 years until they had enough people to build the first building built on this site in 1817. And the people who built that church were of other denominations. They weren't just Methodists. And so the name of the church became the Stony Brook Methodist Episcopal Church. In the first 100 years, it was a very real presence at a time when church was really the center of family life. We were the only Methodist Episcopal church in Stony Brook.
Then, in 1859, some big changes were made. The current structure began its construction, and at the same time, Daniel Jones was appointed as pastor of the church. And only a year after the appointment of Daniel Jones, the current church building came to life.
Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, and you know who he's riding on? A donkey, right?
So this is sort of an official document incorporating the Stony Brook, now Community Church, but at the time Methodist Episcopal Church.
The church building had many uses to the community other than being a place of worship.
Like many large, steeple churches that were built near the water, it was set up high on a hill away from the water, but close enough so that the ship's captains that were finding their way back to port could see the kerosene lights that they would have hanging in the steeple. And those lights were the lights that guided a lot of mariners, back to port here in Stony Brook to the harbor.
At this point, we have reached the church's recent history in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The church has begun to see all sorts of growth. The congregation has been substantially growing in its number of adults and Sunday school size.
In the latter years, the second half of the 200 years, Stony Brook Community Church took a real active role in beginning programs that met needs of the community. Meals on Wheels was something that was founded by our former pastor. Response would be something else that is still in existence today. The Sullivan House, which is where our administration offices are, was built in about 1875. The stained glass windows are not original to the building built in 1859, 1860. There is no date in the records that we can find that tell exactly when they were put in, but we know that in the early part of the 20th century, the church underwent a huge renovation. They think about 1909, some of the windows were put in, and there are 2 that are showing the Sunday school classes in 1911. So that is our best guess for when some of the windows were put in.
It has also begun its transition from Methodist Episcopal Church to just United Methodist.
The church was, as I said, Methodist Episcopal, and in 1951, the name was changed to the Stony Brook Community Church. When you see things officially on documents, it'll say Stony Brook Community Church, United Methodist.
In the late 1900s, many historical events occurred. One event being a lightning bolt striking the steeple of the church.
It was 1984. There was a an a thunder lightning storm, and lightning hit the steeple and caused a great deal of damage. And in the newspaper article, they recounted how the steeple has been important to the community because Stony Brook was one of the areas on the North Shore that was shipbuilders. And so ships were built here and sailed out of Stony Brook Harbor. The ship's captains, when they were sailing back into shore, would use the steeple from our church as a landmark.
Also, the church introduced their longest instated pastor in their history, Reverend John Paul Hankins, in the year of 1966.
It would be impossible to name one memory. There are so many. One of the things that happens when you have a long pastorate is that you have a chance to build relationships with the larger community. Pastors don't stay long enough to put down the kind of roots that allows you to be connected to the community the way that I was privileged to be. You become a fellow traveler with the people with whom you live and who are a part of your congregation. When I first came to Stony Brook, the constitution of the congregation was primarily Grumman people, and gradually that shifted to where it was made up more of university people and people that were in the other professions. That's the first congregation that I served, and the second, and maybe there's more than that, but the second congregation was what evolved.
Longtime members Sue Murphy and Gail Chase look back at their experiences during this recent but important time of the church's history.
There was a strong connection here. It was more like a family as opposed to like a big Catholic church, which is what I was raised in. There was a much more personal touch here. You know, I had friends here, and it just felt more like a family.
I was a young teacher. One of my colleagues asked me if we had picked out a church, and I said no. Lee and Jack White invited Bob and I to come to church and introduced us to everybody, and we really liked it, and so we've been here ever since.
I got married here, and we had to go for our pre-marriage counseling. Jim and I came and met with John Paul Hankins upstairs, and we were living in Manhattan at the time, so we take the train out and we had to meet with him a few times. And one of the things he told us about the wedding ceremony itself, he said, now when you're up there, you know, if the ring doesn't go on, you know, things are going to happen if the ring doesn't go on or whatever. Not to be nervous, don't be fumbling around, just kind of let it go. I was nervous about getting my heels stuck in that heating grate in the floor in the main aisle. So you had to kind of go up on your toes when you walk over that. I didn't get stuck, the rings went on fine. But when John Paul said, okay, you are now husband and wife, he never said, you may kiss the bride, like they do in the movies and on TV. So I turned around and left. And I realized that when I got to the back of the church that Jim was still standing up at the altar. So I walked all the way out after the ceremony to the back, and they made me come all the way back, and everyone was laughing, and we got a standing ovation because he never said you may kiss the bride. So I figured it was over. I was out of there.
I love Advent and Christmas and Easter, all of those big holidays, but I would say every Sunday morning just being in worship is just a very important time to me.
Due to the rise in popularity of Sunday soccer games and other events, attendance began to fall.
If you count in terms of numbers, there has been a 45-50-year decline in the members of the United Methodist Church. We've gone from 12 million membership to about 7 million members now. That's a lot of losing seasons.
When we first came here, it was a huge congregation. When our children were in Sunday school, it was a thriving Sunday school. There were even more than one class at each level. Church is no longer a priority for people. It seems like other things have taken their place, like the soccer games on Sunday for the children. And that, I think, is very sad.
Later on in 2003, John Paul Hankins left the church, allowing for others to take over. 6 years after Reverend John Paul Hankins left, the church celebrated the 200th anniversary of the congregation.
It was great, and we were all so proud. You know, I remember really a feeling of pride because our church is a beautiful church. You know, I mean, physically it's beautiful. We all came together, and we had a catered dinner in the back building that I helped organize, and it was, yeah, I just remember feeling really proud that I was a member of this church. I still feel that way.
200 years, an absolutely incredible feat by any church. However, the church continues to stand, appeasing the needs of many local Methodists on Sunday mornings.
One of the great facts of the life of this congregation has been the Apple Festival community event, where we serve the interests and the recreational events of a whole congregation, and the focus of drawing people together.
Probably if you speak to people both in the church and in the community, the one thing they'll talk about is our annual church fair. The fair had its roots probably about 1960, as best we can tell. We have one of the bulletins from 1965, and it does state that it was the 5th annual fair. So we are making the assumption that the church fair was begun about 1960.
The church is currently led by Reverend Chuck Van Houten, who has been making headway in transforming the church for the 21st century.
First off, one of the things I do whenever I get to any church is start a whole bunch of new Bible studies and book studies. I do book studies for people that aren't used to doing Bible studies, that are somewhat intimidated by that, to help them grow. The other thing is we took an entire, 9 months last year to go through a whole visioning process, to not only create a vision statement and a mission statement, but to really understand why we were doing this and get everybody in the church to be talking about it. We had Saturday morning meetings to talk about visioning what that means. And now we have a very definite mission. It's a basic mission, but by taking the time to do that, everyone has gotten on board. The other big focus that we're working on turning around, and we've definitely taken some good strides in that, is to revitalize and grow the Sunday school. In my last couple of churches, it was pretty easy to pull a band together, but when we got here, it took about 3 years. It was actually getting a little depressing for me, because I realized how much I enjoy that and how much I get out of doing that, especially in church, in worship, having a band to play with. This is a good story. I mean, what happened was, about 2 years ago, in February, there was this massive snowstorm on a late Saturday night into Sunday morning. So I sent an email to the congregation on that Saturday night and said, stay home, don't bother coming, we're closing, but I'll be there and put coffee on just in case somebody doesn't get this message. So I got there, and this gentleman, Robert, and his wife, Fran, who lived just a few houses down from the church across the street, they couldn't get to their church that day, so they decided to walk over to our church and see if we were having a service. Well, I was the only one there, and I had coffee on, so we sat down, and as God would have it, we started talking and discovered that we both play guitars and like to sing in church. And we just got together and said, okay, what songs do you know? What do you know? And we just pulled a couple songs together, and in October of that year, first week of October, we, as a duet, did a song in church. And before you knew it, people were volunteering to be in the band, to the point where by Christmas of that year, 2 months later, we had 3 adults in the band, 3 teenagers, and 1 9-year-old and 1 10-year-old, all making music together. It wasn't perfect, but it was a joy, and we started having so much fun, and we've been doing it now for 1.5 years since then.
So next time you're in the historic town of Stony Brook, be sure to stop by the Stony Brook Community Church and experience 200 years of amazing, rich history.